Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to get started on the second cycle of READance. So READance we started sometime mid last year when we had our first cycle. And we're hoping this year to have a more sort of continuous, a reading group going. Of course, all of you, I'm sure, have read a little about it, but just to introduce the spirit in which we do this, for me, of course, I mean, just to be able to read like a diverse set of books has always been a desire, a wish. And most often what happens is that kind of gets relegated to lower down on the priority, right? Among so many other things that takes over life. So I started this idea of a reading group much more from a selfish point of view, saying that if I had a group of people to read with, I think I'll be a bit more regular, and I'll just have this ability to come back every week, right, with ideas in your mind and share those ideas with each other is also a great way to not read something in a flat manner, right? That was another thing that I was hoping we could do, and of course that's what the first cycle did for us, and we're really hopeful and excited for the cycles going forward. We keep the sessions extremely informal and friendly. Okay, so there's nothing formal about these sessions at all. We're hoping for everybody to share as openly as you would like to, whether it's opinions, disagreements, open-ended questions, perhaps for which we can go and seek answers to. So we're looking at this as a space where we can all just speak our minds, right? Without holding back in any way. So welcome to all of you. Lovely to have you. And I'm just going to quickly introduce Santosh, who's with us. Santosh, say hi. And you all received your emails from her, so I'm sure the name is familiar. And Lakshmi, both of whom have been with me, in the previous cycle as well, and have been really brainstorming, helping to sort of put this reading group together. So we'll get started without, further ado. Just for today, because we're all fresh to the thing. So Santosh, me, and Lakshmi are going to sort of take the lead on just leading the discussion forward, starting with a little bit of a summary on, the chapters that we were meant to read, so that we can open it out to discussions after that. And by the end of the session, I'll try and, give you a sense of what is the format that we're thinking of going forward. So any ideas of, better formats or other things that we can do is also always welcome. So I'll just start with a summary of we'll take up the Muthulakshmi Reddy biography first. And of course, we're reading only the first chapter there, right? So what I've tried to do is just put from a different perspective a summary of the book, so that we can revisit sort of, ideas, concepts, states, places, things like that, from a fresh perspective to round our heads around the chapter per se. But before I actually dive into that, there was, I was quite pleasantly taken by there's a quotation right in the beginning of that book, if you notice, by Gopal Krishna Gandhi, which I found very, apt to, in fact, starting this discussion, because there was a very specific reason why we chose to read 2 books this cycle and not just one, because we're aware that the lives of these 2 women, Bangalore Nagaratnammal on one end and Muthulakshmi Reddy on the other, are their lives, at least for us from the perspective of being dancers, is very relevant to each other. Whether or not they crossed paths in their own lives, the work that they did and the ideas that they stood for, I think in both their cases, it's very seminal to all of us practicing dance today. So we thought it would be nice to see what happens if we can, read these 2 biographies in parallel, right? And what Gopal Krishna Gandhi says there, I think, is something that, in fact, it was a good reminder to me to basically not, judge as we read, right? Because he of course says, I do wish she had a vein of art in her as well, that could have enabled her to see and say that the tradition she wanted to abolish had a precious possession within it that needed salvaging, protecting, and nurturing. But I really love what he says after that. We cannot, of course, have everything that we want our way. Muthulakshmi plus art, Balasaraswati minus seclusion, Rukmini Devi plus Shringara, Supalakshmi minus Sanskritization. These are all our wish lists based on our predispositions and prejudices. Each of these icons had guiding passions and pursued them. I thought that was such a fantastic way to set the tone for, reading with an open mind and reading without judgment. So with that, I'll just go on to the summary of the Muthulakshmi Reddy book. Okay, so can all of you see the slides? Okay, great. So what I try to do is just put together. So first of all, I think just to start with what I took away from this chapter as a whole, it seemed to me that what the author was trying to do was inspire the very basic sort of triggers, at least in Muthulakshmi Reddy's life, that sort of pushed her to not just an education, but an education at the highest level. The trigger of why she perhaps decided to pursue a medical, degree, and why she was interested in the medical field. And she also leaves us with the basic trigger of circumstances, right? Parentage, ancestry, things that were happening when she was growing up, which perhaps literally set the tone for the rest of her life, right? And the choices she made and the various ventures that she did. So that was for me the kind of overall takeaway. And just to summarize various things about her personally, so C.N. Muthulakshmi is what she was born as. And interestingly, in this Kovilur is the place where her mother was born, which seems to be a place that is further down south from Pudukkottai, where she herself was born. And Narayan Swami, of course, was the name of her father. And the author does make a mention that it was unusual or very rare for children born into what she chooses to call the Melakara family, right? I suppose it is the same thing what we understand as the Devadasi community. Perhaps in different regions were called by different names, but those born into this community to actually take the father's name. That was a very rare thing. So she, in fact, took the reference of her mother's birthplace, which was very common, as well as her father's first name, which is an interesting thing. Born in the year 1886, the mother, of course, she states that the name is Chandramal, belonged to the Melakara family. But I found it interesting that there's no record of her own ancestry, like her mother's name or where she, sort of came from isn't really mentioned, at least in this chapter. While, of course, her father, S. Narayan Sami Iyer, was born into the Brahmin community. So that becomes salient, from the perspective of understanding her exposures and how she grew up. As was the case with most patrons of women from the Devadasi community, he was married to a lady by the name Sivakamu, but unfortunately lost both, I think, two children that they had in its infancy. So he did not have children via his wife, but all his children were therefore born by his partner from the Devadasi community, who was Chandraman. Right? So Muthulakshmi was the oldest of four siblings, two sisters, one brother, and clearly already a very, very impressive, educational lineup, I think, even from modern perspectives, right? In terms of how far she went, simply in terms of her, educational pursuit. And as is repeatedly told to us over and over again, which, she was, in most of the cases, the only girl studying in that school, right? Or one of very, very few, or the only woman to pass in matriculation in that particular year, and so on and so forth. So very much a rarity for a girl to go to school at all or to pursue education at that level, but all the more so as being a girl who was identified as belonging to the Devadasi community, right? Because of her mother's side. So I thought it'd be interesting to just put together a summary of the places that the author talks about, which I just did this exercise for myself, so I thought it was interesting to share. So Pudukkottai, where she is born, she does make this mention of the place called Kodumbalur, which is a place that finds mentioned in the Silappatikaram, and a place where Kovalan and Madhavi actually pass through during their sort of journey. And she also talks about how the I don't know if you can probably see it on the left figure a little better. So this river is the river that she sort of mentions. I think it's Vellalar river that sort of splits in half between what was Soranadu on top, so the kingdoms or whatever, the place that was ruled by the Soras, and further down below was Madurai, which was the Pandya kingdom. So that's kind of the setup. I found that just personally, historically interesting. I don't know how it will connect up to her life and if at all it does. But also specifically within the Pudukkottai, just trying to understand where they lived. And, she mentions this place called Machuvadi, if that's the right way to pronounce it, within Pudukkottai, where she was born. And the interesting mention was that whatever the local temple over there was, around that temple, the Brahmin community and the Devadasi community pretty much lived around the same area, right? So they both those communities came from the same area. And I also jotted down some of the mentions that were done for the dance centers particularly. It mentions Virali Malai, right, which is well further down from Pudukkottai, as one of the sort of influential centers close to Pudukkottai, where there were a lot of dancers, Devadasis, the practice of dance was very, very prevalent. And also mentions the Tirugokarnam Brihadambal temple, where apparently there were a lot of Devadasis who practiced, and there was a lot of activity. So just to get a sense that around where she was sort of born and she lived most part of her younger life, there was actually a lot of artistic activity of the Devadasi community going on. So that was the reason why I kind of picked this out. The next thing for me that struck me were the number of male figures that have been mentioned in this chapter as being extremely influential in, moving her education forward in many ways, right? Of course, first and foremost, it seems like her father was very, very instrumental in pushing for that education of, his firstborn child. No matter that she's a woman, no matter that he faced a lot of opposition for bringing her into that spaces, but he really used his influences to convert opportunities to get into school, to get into medical school, and so on. The other is, interestingly, the king of Pudukkottai at that point of time, right? Who himself seems to have really had an open mind to sort of accept her into the local college initially, and then also give her a pretty generous scholarship to go and have her medical education in Chennai. But it had an interesting point about how he was very influenced by European education and ways of life. And it did mention that at some point he moved to live outside India. I just wanted to make a note of it here to see whether in some way that is relevant later on. Although at this point in time, I don't know how that sort of, pans out in the sequence of things. And then clearly principals of her school, her college, professors, all of who are male figures, who at some point of time either supported her right from the very beginning or, had some initial objections, but later on turned around when they saw how intelligent, how sharp, how smart she was. So, and I just felt the reason why this really struck me was, while we do constantly, talk about, opposition, or how it's very difficult for women to have made this sort of, or to break that ceiling that sort of existed. It was primarily, and over and over again, so many male figures who supported her, growth in the education. So I thought that was an interesting takeaway for me. And I'm just going to leave it as the last thing, as a few parts in the chapter that I found, where I would like to sort of know, what you thought when you read about it as well, because I felt like it stood out to me as something that potentially could be discussed, right? So one was this quote from page 14, which is a little bit from, I think, page 13, but it talks about the Melakara community. It says they were trained in music and dance and were permitted to perform in temple processions and rituals and for the public and social occasions. So I found the use of the word permitted interesting, because my understanding from previous readings was that this is what they did for a living, versus when you communicated as they were allowed to do something or permitted to do something. So that was a sort of a word that I took note of. It says marriage in the conventional sense was barred for them according to religious rules, but they could be chosen by an upper caste male patron. So the question I had here was, is that a precise definition of what was actually going on? Could they also choose a patron, or were they in fact only chosen by a patron? So that was a question I had. And of course, it mentions that the children were not acknowledged by the fathers. Once again, the tonality of this paragraph is essentially what I wanted to open out for discussion, because it seems to have a sort of a passive tonality for the community, saying that they were permitted, they were barred, they were not acknowledged, and so on and so forth, right? So it feels like they did not have agency in any of these matters. So that's something that I wanted to bring up for just for your thoughts, which clearly connected also for me with the fact that the ancestry of Chandraman wasn't mentioned in this entire sort of picture at all. The second thing for me was, yes, this, I just think towards the end of the first page and the beginning of the second page. So it kind of, I found it interesting that somehow the attachment of this patron called Narayan Swami to Chandramal seemed to be orchestrated, or orchestrated is a strong word, but organized, right, or suggested or inspired by somebody who was the king's family. So in one sense, it seems to me like there was official and social sanction for this system. But the immediate second part of the paragraph says that, it wasn't accepted for a Brahmin to go to a Devadasi's family and have a meal, but it was very openly accepted, that the Bottukattuthal and the patronage could have been done. So that confused me a little. And it also said Pudukkottai gradually, though reluctantly, came to accept this arrangement. So the question that I had from this was this not a socially accepted system? Or was this a result of already the deterioration of the system and how it was looked upon at that time? Or was this how, the author claims the system was throughout? So that was one thing. And the last thing I'll leave you with is this paragraph where it says Chandramal's family had rejoiced at the birth of a girl child who could be dedicated to the temple and become the earning member in the family, whereas that was not the case in the upper caste, because the girl child was a burden and needed to be married off. This sentence, or this response of the two families, then for me, didn't match up with everything that happened later, where it was her mom who was constantly trying to get her married off, and her father who was constantly, pushing her education. So that was another sort of inconsistency for me in my head that I'd love to sort of open out for discussion if anyone had thoughts. So that's all from me from this summary. We will probably just to kind of keep it in order, so if I can request Lakshmi to do the summary for the 2 chapters from the other book that we were meant to read, and after that we can open it up. Yeah.
Sure. So I'll just briefly talk us through some of the main themes and ideas that came up in both these chapters. So in the first chapter, it gives us an account of some of the early life and experiences of Nagaratnam. So she was born to Muthulakshmi Ammal, and her mother's name is not recorded, so we again don't have her ancestry, and this the author notes is a bit strange for someone from this community. But her father was Subanna, who was a wealthy Brahmin in Mysore. So when she was about 1.5 years old, we're told that Muthulakshmi breaks up with her patron, and she travels with Nagaratnam to Mysore, where they seek patronage in. So Mysore at this point was under the rule of the Vodiyar dynasty, and this dynasty is known for like building lavish temples and employed musicians in the temple-controlled palaces. So at this point, Chamaraja Vodiyar had ascended the throne in 1868, and Nagaratnam's mother manages to find a patron in one of his court poets, Timaya. And what I felt was a little bit unusual here was that the patron actually takes on responsibility for teaching Nagaratnam. So she has her initial training in music and Sanskrit under him. But eventually we're told that that this relationship was fraying and they part on unfavorable terms. The families then, her mother pursues a search to find the right person to continue her education. So the family first seek the Danakoti sisters in Kanchipuram, and then they set off to Bangalore, where her mother's uncle is based. And here she's trained in music. She learns violin from him, and she's also taught dance by Bangalore Kirtana. And she also learns Abhinaya from Madras, Thiruvenkatachar. And the author also gives us a little bit about what's happening in Bangalore. He holds the view that the developments that were happening in Bangalore, the Maharaja of Mysore purchasing land and constructing a palace there at the time, and the presence and performance of the Devadasi dancers for Prince Albert Victor when he arrived, sort of spurs on her ambition to see Nagaratnam perform in the courts. So she's intent on her becoming a court dancer at this time. And it's interesting to note that here at this point, around 1809, is discussions that begin to happen about the morality of the women of this community. But nevertheless, Muthulakshmi passes away in 1891, and Nagaratnam continues to visit Mysore, where she performs at the house of a court musician, and eventually is introduced into the palace and starts performing as a court artist there. But this stint is brief, and the Vodiyar passes away at this time. So she's now in search of a new patron. So Munaswami, she now makes her way to Bangalore, and here she finds another patron, Narahari, under whom he is her patron, and he builds a house for her in Mount Joy, to take her away from some of the discussions of the morality that was happening, and to be able to see her. And she becomes renowned. We say the locals remember the mountain by his name and as her abode. And the next, however, Narahari passes away as well in 1902. And she's now on, but before that, he manages to get her another patron in Chennai. And she moves to the colonial city of Madras permanently in about 1903. This is more or less at this time comprised of Georgetown, and we're told that there is a culture of music making and performances here. So there's an increasing number of sabhas that are growing at this point, and we're told that the performers received patronage under the Komati and Reddy Chetty communities and Mudaliyar communities, as well as among a lot of the royal family, Telugu-speaking royal families who had then moved to Chennai. There's also a significant Devadasi presence in the city. We've listed a range of performers who moved there either to sing and dance or or temporarily to perform in the venues here. So, Nagaratnam seems to have come into contact with many of them, like the Anamal lineage, who seem to have become close acquaintances. We're told that by 1905, she's doing very well here and has numerous performances. The author notes that she began to pay income tax when was one among the first professional women to do so. She had, in her early years, we're told of particularly an interesting incident that happened where she wanted to perform a Kuravanji in Tiruvarur, but then this was met by a lot of resistance from the women performers of that temple, the Pundi family, who went to great legislative lengths to prevent her from being able to take over this. So there's a sense of hereditary right or something they wanted to preserve there. So, but Nagaratnam's own directions takes different direction. And when the discussions happen in 1908, 1909, she decides to stop dancing and to start declining dance performances and start focusing on music instead. She's also one among the first to step into the gramophone recording. So 1904-05, we're told she's featured in several of the recordings done by the Gramophone and Typewriter Limited, a company that had just started to create records in South India. And we're also told that towards the end, she starts giving Sanskrit upanyasams in privately held homes of businessmen. And the author claims that she was one among the very first women to do so, and that this was quite a successful take. That's like a very brief summary.
Thank you. Thanks, Lakshmi. So, yeah, with that, we can, I think, open the floor for comments, thoughts, opinions of any sort, either from, the few points that have been already mentioned or anything else that, your thoughts as you were reading the books. And I think, going forward, we can discuss both the books interchangeably. So, anyone?
Okay, I just wanted to quickly add from the sorry for my voice, it's just under the weather. Just wanted to quickly add about the patrons. You were mentioning within Muthulakshmi Reddy's book, and what really struck me in the introduction in chapter 1 in the other book was how Muthulakshmi, when she fell apart with her patron M. Subbarao, and how the life actually shattered for them, like the parting became very painful. And then in the introduction of the same book, there is also a mention about properties that they received from the patrons, which was like, which came along with it. And then that was passed on to the daughters, either they adopted the adopted daughters or whatever it was. There was some context of the property association as well. Also, what I felt very interesting in the same words where a new patron had to be found. And then the patron finding, if you look at Giribhatta Timaya, he decided to take the mother and the daughter when they were in search of another patron, which is quite interesting. And then also brings in a thought whether they were also, whether it was a mutual agreement to it, or whether it was the patron who had to kind of find the Devadasi valuable enough to kind of give them that opportunity, both being a space in their lives and bringing their talent out. It was quite interesting because that became an ego when she was kicked out as well, and she had to leave Mysore, and it became an ego. She wanted to bring her daughter back to the court, and she said if not, then that will be the end of their lives. So it was quite interesting to see how they reacted to these kind of situations, and it just brings the relationship of the word patron very much different to how we look at it. So that's what that were the thoughts that I kind of had, and it was quite interesting to see whether you think from, I mean, which perspective to think about. So yeah, just thought I'll share that.
Thanks, Santosh. Thanks for sharing that. Anyone else? Any other thoughts? Please feel free to just unmute and speak.
Okay, if I can go. So it is a point out that at one point, Nagaratnam was about to be exploited, but then her guru, Sri Hyderabad, sorry, I forgot his name. Let me get it right. Hyderabad Munu Swamapa. He actually comes to her rescue, and she happens to be protected by him. So here the guru protects the student. So later on in her life also, Veena Sheshanna did the same thing to Nagaratnama, where she was protected by her guru, and she was not taken very lightly among the society. So that is one thing I wanted to point out. And sorry to divert, the place currently where I am is just a 1 minute's walk away from Mount Joy. So it's quite nearby for me. Yeah. Yeah, that is what I have to say.
Oh, thanks very much, Shashank. In fact, I was, I'm also because Bangalorean, I was also looking up the area. But do you see anything? Because I'm completely ignorant of that area. But is there sort of within the area? Is there I don't know? Is there like a memorial, or do you see her name anywhere or anything like that?
Actually, unfortunately, I haven't come across any name of hers. But the temple that is mentioned in the text here, it's still there, and they still worship there. So it's been converted to a park where people go around. So it's a beautiful park around this area right now.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's really nice. Thank you. I actually, again, short, what can you do short of actually going around and looking at the place? So since we're talking about that, let me just show you. So it's trying to just map out the area in Bangalore. So that's how it looks. Shashank, you can correct me if I've circled the wrong place, but it seems like, so Cubbon Park is up there, right? So, which is the well-known Cubbon Park, and this is the Nagaratpete where she initially arrived. And then this down here is the area of Mount Joy. And this, I think, was the place near Bangalore Medical College where her patron's residence was. So central, absolute, and this is Lal Bagh right next to it. So very, very central Bangalore now, where we, probably commute like a zillion times, never thinking or acknowledging the history of the place. But
exactly.
Anyone else? Yeah, Shashank, please go on if you had anything to add.
No. Please carry.
Can I say something?
Yes, please. Yes, Maitri.
Hi, I'm Maitri. So the one thing that I found very interesting in both the books was that they talk about both the matriarchal system of property inheritance, and that the upper caste would donate, they would give their daughter for adoption. And they also talk about how the society did not support or did not welcome them at stages. And when I was reading Muthulakshmi Reddy, I think one of the things that I thought was quite stark was that if Devadasis were God's wife and they were still treated less in compared, coming from the community of Melakara, they were treated less outside the temple, but they were allowed to be God's wife. So this I found was common in both the books, and how the father was a very instrumental figure in the case of Muthulakshmi Reddy, and how the mother was instrumental in Bangalore Nagaratnama's case. where she, driven by personal interests, she made sure that her daughter had every chance of making a career through arts.
Thanks, Maitreyi. Yeah, I think that's also the kind of conundrum that all of us are always in search of, right? Understanding the community from that perspective. Why were they at the same time given such an exalted status, you know, as well as, you know, kind of a relegated status within society? And I think understanding, hopefully more books of this nature will open out our understanding in that direction of whether one became the other or whether both existed parallelly, you know, throughout timelines. So I think definitely as we go further into these two books and hopefully other books that also talk about the history of these people's lives, I think. But thank you. I think that's a very important point.
Hi.
So if I can go for Muthu Reddy's, can I have put one point out?
Sure. Shashank, go ahead, please.
So it's also mentions that there was when she was studying in her matriculations, there was a curtain drawn between the boys section and the girls section. So that's something very interesting to me, and that shows the community was not open for girls' education. Second thing is, it's probably that she was the only girl child who was studying, and she brought in a couple of changes. She basically set the tone for girls' education at the time, and also coming from a community which was not formally educated, but arts and culture was a predominant trait. So it was a very different kind of tone that she set for all the future generations there. So that is something I wanted to share.
Yeah, thank you. No, definitely so. But also, I think the understanding of, you know, what education also meant, right, to these communities going prior. Because I think, like, if you look at, in contrast, we look at Nagaratnamal's life, her proficiency in languages, in, you know, so many aspects, in, of course, music, dance, but it didn't stop with that, right? Sanskrit grammar, you know. So what do we call this? She just didn't go to a formal school and matriculate, but I think they had access to education. And I think there was also a mention somewhere there about how there was an interesting comparison between personalities of Veene Dhanammal and Bangalore Nagaratnamal. And it, you know, one of the things that was said about her is someone who could hold a conversation, somebody who could charm a room, somebody who could keep everybody engaged. So, I mean, that's our definition of anybody who gains, right, the highest whatever educational degrees right now. So perhaps it could have also marked the transition in many ways of what started being considered education in India, right? In many ways. That so the if you were a dancer and a singer, and I think that's an unfortunate truth that continues to this day, right? Dance is not considered in education anymore, or music is not considered in education. So perhaps it was also that turning point that was going on in the early 1900s in India. That's interesting.
Apurva, can I add to that?
Yes, please. Yes.
So yeah, I just have a few notes on the Muthulakshmi Reddy chapter. So I think I personally was very interested in the Muthulakshmi Reddy book, especially because there is actually a new Amar Chitra Katha. I don't know if you've read it. It's called something like like 5 Trailblazing Women of India, something along those lines. And I saw Muthulakshmi Reddy's name in that a long time ago. And I had also, she's also a woman that you really hear of when you hear of feminism in India and women pathbreakers. So what was interesting to me is that as a feminist and as a generally as someone who likes reading, that was my view of Muthulakshmi Reddy. But as a dancer who is interested in understanding the critical history of Bharatnatyam, you would always see that black and white video of Muthulakshmi Reddy in any documentary that is talking about, and like she is advocating for a few minutes for the abolition of the Devadasi Act. So she's speaking in Parliament. So these were two. So right at the onset, she was a bit of a paradox in my mind, and I think that it was very hard for me to reconcile these two I had. And I think the first chapter paints a very good picture of trying to, like you said, paint a picture of what her influences were, her triggers were. And it seems like because she was a living paradox, right? Her dad's side of the family is probably not probably, it's definitely why she was so educated. And you spoke about how he was such an important influence for her to become the person, the kind of privileged person she was in terms of education. But from her mother's side, she had to experience discrimination. They talk about how she is faced discrimination on the streets of Pudukkottai, and they've painted this contrast very well. So I think from the chapter, I was better able to understand probably what her motives were and how she got to be the person she was. So that's just a note that I wanted to talk about. Yeah.
What I'm also wondering is like there are two different ways of this whole record. Like there's a contrast between these two books, right? Especially Apurva, when you started saying like the tone of how that history is described in the Muthulakshmi Reddy book versus when you see the extensive detail that's there in Nagaratnam's book. That was the first thing that struck me. And then again, it's also a difference of 10 years, right? Muthulakshmi Reddy was 10 years younger. Is it just the extent to which information is recorded in these two books, or did so much change in 10 years? Some speculation around that. But by and large, the point that you mentioned about education, that's interesting in terms of how what is considered to be education also changes. I observe it as it's simply a lens of who was the formative, who was the influential figure, consistent influential figure in each of their lives. So I think that at least for these two people, because of how Narayana Swami Iyer was a principal in a school, and he was such a loud advocate for Muthulakshmi Reddy in her life. And as Via Devika ma'am quotes, how it is quite different for the father to continue to be present in such a child's life when they never did that. They had these alliances with women outside of their marriage, but they were never involved in the child. But then Narayana Swami Iyer was a different person. He was there, so that influence is in terms of the academics, whereas Nagaratnam's mom, the only goal she had was, I was humiliated here, I need to come back. Like we need to be vindicated. And this is the only goal I set for my girl. And when I look at the timelines of Nagaratnam, she was so young when all of this happened. If I understand correctly, she was barely 11 or 14 by the time her mom died. But by then, so much of importance to learning languages, learning violin, and all of that. And I'm wondering, what were we doing when we were 11? We were just doing a bunch of things. But then her life purpose was set when she was barely 9 years old, something like that. So that was interesting. But what is now so very interesting for me is the difference in how these two books are written, and how much of it is just the style of writing, or how much of it is also to speculate what happened between those two times.
Yep, I think that contrast was, sorry.
No, sorry, go ahead.
No, so I mean, I think that contrast was really interesting, as you mentioned. So I did read in other sources that Muthulakshmi Reddy had little to no contact with her maternal family, and that part of the condition of her father taking on her education And that relationship between them and between his family was tolerated because she was not allowed contact with her maternal family, and they wanted to bring her up through maybe a conventional education. So I did find another source. Muthulakshmi Reddy herself has written 2 autobiographies, of which I didn't find the full text, but I do have another article, another paper that kind of analyzes her autobiographies from a feminist lens. So I'll share that. But what I found really interesting was the way she also presented her own autobiography. So that had like excerpts of her own writing, and the way she presented that. She speaks about women not being allowed to have a life outside of their homes, about being entirely dependent on male patrons or their support, which seemed very, to me, paradoxical given that she came from this community. And that, others at the same time, Nagaratnam was more or less the same timeline. They had an independent life, and we're told she's one of the first women who filed an income tax report, meaning she was financially okay. But here she really writes about that, and about women not having their freedom and needing to step out. But she also draws on some similar feminist tropes. She says women being in the legislature makes them more caring, that they need to nurture. And so the way she presents women in the legislature itself takes on the way she looks at women and their role itself. There's also tones of that traditional stereotypical feminine role. So I thought that was really interesting. So I'll pop the link to that paper in the comments.
To add to your point, Lakshmi, I think that's what you were mentioning was really interesting, and I think it's simply the difference, or this is probably simplifying it, but it's maybe the difference between having, like for Muthulakshmi Reddy, having her father be the prominent figure in her life versus for Nagaratnam ma'am, her mother being the prominent force in her life. Although both of them were heavily influenced by Devadasi culture in their in the first times, like in their childhood, and they both probably faced this adversity that came from being associated with this community. But it was the figure who helped them progress through society that probably had an effect on their psyche, as in, like, if Muthulakshmi Reddy was able to progress through society by cutting ties with her maternal side, then she kind of probably developed this idea that this kind of Devadasi culture is not something that will help her progress through society, and then the opposite for Nagaratnam ma'am, because that Devadasi culture is what actually helped her make a name for herself. So it's kind of, you can see people progressing in opposite directions, although they're coming from the same childhood, like kind of the same childhood, simply based on the figures that were helping them through their experiences. I think that was interesting.
Santosh, were you going to add something at that time? You got interrupted.
No, it was just a thought. Then, do we then look at both of them, understanding the term Devadasi more as an occupational group rather than a community group? Because there's a lot of difference when we use the word occupational group versus how it's kind of then delineated to a community, and then it's kind of Western, and then it's kind of looked at both their segments, but where both their periods, then in the start of Devadasi being an occupational group rather than a community and caste divided. So for me, that was a question mark there, like, did they come from that umbrella of thought process?
So I actually found something on this in the introductory chapter of the Bangalore Nagaratnam book, which actually, it was great analysis and it was very well written. So they were talking about how maybe around 2000 years ago, at the time of when they were talking about the Brihadishwara temple specifically, so that was around 200 AD. At that time, there were about 450 Devadasis. They used the word employed by the king. And at that point of time, these were not, he uses the word a professional guild rather than an actual caste. So they make the link between how art flourishes at a time when, there is a halcyon period in civilization. And as a result of that, we see that there were a lot of Devadasis employed at the temple. And these Devadasis were from different strata of society. They were from different castes. They were not from one particular section of society. But then I think civilizationally, there were a lot of changes over some time. And that's why, because they weren't getting again, they use the word shares of agricultural land and rice, ration, things like that. They had to look for patrons. And that is why, because once the patron would not claim that that their children were theirs and they wouldn't bring them up, the Devadasis would have to take them and basically raise their children. And that's when it started to become from a professional guild, it started to become a caste of itself, because the boys would learn instruments, they would become natavanas, but the women would be trained in dance and music and all of this. So I thought that analysis was actually amazing. It had answered a lot of questions that I had about basically the relationship between dance, politics, and civilization at the time, and how that, like, I think those links were made in a way that I've never seen before, actually. It was quite amazing in that introductory chapter.
I think that's really interesting as well. I've actually heard and I've read in the writings of Devadasi that Devadasi as a term itself was not used in the vernacular. It came into existence in Portuguese texts as the first. So the term Dasi was used, but the connection to temples and especially the way he sets it up, I think, in the first chapter of the preface, we start by being told that there are dance in Greece, in Greek temple rituals, and several other countries. And then he talks about the Devadasi connection. But I think that that term is seen often in writing about dance in the European literature, but the term is not a vernacular term, and it came into use much later. So I thought that was interesting. And also, I guess, just the timeline. Some scholars I've read argue that, the earlier references, like the Chola period references, are very sporadic. We don't know enough about their communities. And also in the way he presents the introduction, because he speaks about how there were multiple wars in this period, it changes hands multiple different times politically. And there's not enough evidence to establish like a continual link. So the notion that there was dance both in temples and in courts started to come about much later, only like about the 16th century. So I found both of that interesting. It's like how do we define what this community was?
And another thing I found interesting from that chapter was because you were talking about the Devadasi community and how I think we have a very external view of things, which is very inaccurate in many ways. So they were talking about how even, I think, throughout this, wherever you'd see this practice, whether it was in 2nd century in Tanjore or even much later, closer uh, to the British Raj and stuff like that, you would see that there were Devadasi, they were definitely, all Devadasis were dedicated to the temple, and they'd have that Bottakatal, I don't know if I said it right, that ritual to marry them to the Lord. But within the Devadasis, there's a line in the same chapter that says that this was also a stratified community, which mean in terms of their occupation. So the most senior Devadasi would be the one that would actually perform the ritualistic dance, which we just assume with the word Devadasi. But they would also be more involved with the day-to-day activities of the temple in terms of just washing the vessels or cleaning the floors or things like that. This is also something that they actively did, the probably more junior Devadasis. So I just thought that was interesting because you say Devadasi, and I think we're conditioned to have this image of someone who's doing a ritualistic dance, but they also had different, I think, relationships with the temple in terms of what their activities were.
That's something, in fact, has, I think, an interesting parallel in the North Indian practice as well. Because I was recently reading this book on Gohar Jan by Vikram Sampath, which essentially traces the life of the Bai, as they were called, right, in most of North India. And this particular aspect, Anushka, which you mentioned, is exactly what they talk about. Of course, in the case in North India, this association with a religious center was not there. That aspect was not there, but it was very much. I mean, once again, if you look at it as a professional setup, right? There has to be hierarchy within the setup. There has to be somebody who does different people who do different parts of the job, and they have to have some way of deciding it. So the hierarchy, in fact, over there also existed an internal hierarchy between the musician and the musician dancer. So apparently the musician was the highest in the hierarchy in terms of so there was even a hierarchy between them, and the musician who the lady who sang and danced came below, and then the dancer came below that, and everybody, of course, it goes into all of that, the people who decorate the place, the people who would entertain the guests, the people who would so on and so forth. So it's actually an entire community, and the way they of course they had, I think, differences in the way they addressed like whether you were addressed as Bai or Jan or so on and so forth, what your suffix was indicated your status within the group. But of course, with the South Indian system, there is, of course, that understanding of who decided this is not clear, right? Who decided that I would be that dancer, the main dancer performing the ritual versus the one tying the flowers? But it seemed, if I'm not wrong, the suggestion within this North Indian system was there was space to move. It was not a rigid system. So you don't land somewhere and stay there for the rest of your life. Ideally, if you were talented and you had a prowess in music, or you were moving forward with your training in music, you could move whatever up or down that ladder, as the case may be. So almost like being employed in an office now, right? You could be promoted or demoted based on how you perform. So rounds up to that idea of it actually being a professional guild, right? In so many ways. But
to add to that, I had this interesting observation. It felt really interesting to me to see that, okay, in one place they say that upper caste, they patronage and they support the art. And in the next same para, in another sentence, they say that, okay, if the poor Brahmins who are not able to take care of their kid, they would come and give it to the Devadasi and they would take care of the kid. And another thing was that I questioned myself, as a society we have come with, whether we have come far from the point of view of the feminism that we say, because when the she went to study, there was a curtain, and it was she who had to made sure that the boys did not fall into the slipped in their characters. And I think we are still in the same phase. We just think that, okay, we have come a long way, but I don't think so. My mom, she in the 70s, 1970s, she was the only one who did the masters, and she had this group picture, everyone are in suit and she was the only one in the sari. I don't know where we are headed, whether we have to think through what we are doing, how to go ahead with it. I don't know. So that's what's.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, to think that it's been 100 years since, right? These two women, and many of the issues that we're debating or discussing hasn't changed all that much. is definitely interesting. Any other thoughts?
Okay, this is Gayatri.
Yes.
I would just like to add on to this point. When I was reading both of these chapters, what I saw, something that was common in both of them was the power of resilience. No matter how many adversities they had faced in their life, they always rose back. And not just rose back to a common level, but rose back to power. So resilience is something that I picked up from both of these chapters. And if we are talking in the timeline where Muthulakshmi Reddy Ammal is younger to Nagaratna Ammal, then wherein Nagaratna Ammal had written that Javadi to, ask, uh, I forgot the name of, so for him to speak to her, we as a society, I think, have become regressive in the next 10 years, where we are still creating that division between boys and girls to, even feel free to study. So I'm not sure about the timeline, whether Muthulakshmi Ammal is younger or Nagaratna Ammal is younger. These are some points that intrigue me. And the far-sightedness of Nagaratna Ammal to, be the first one to step into the recording and think about what is next for the artist community is something also that intrigued me.
Yeah, thanks, Gayatri. So actually, since you raised that thing, maybe it's a good moment. We'll just take a quick minute or two. Lakshmi, if you can bring up the timeline that you've drawn. We'll share all these resources, either that we've created or if there are any links, with the group so that, it's available for you to look at later. But Lakshmi, would you like to share that? And can you bring it up on screen share, Lakshmi? That might be simple to do.
Sure.
I have also, in the meantime, that it is Matad Bharat, and I just shared a link of that. Actually, I think we're seeing the paper, right? That you were talking about. Was this the paper?
Yes, this was. Sorry, just give me a moment. I'll bring up the timeline.
Sure, no problem.
Also, in the meantime, Gayatri, I think I felt very, again, that, yeah, the Muthulakshmi Reddy book, like I said, I had a very specific set of things that I wanted to take back from it in terms of like reconciling that paradox that was in my head. But then I think, there's certainly a role of luck in her life at multiple points when, she's born to Narayanaswamy Iyer, but he chooses to acknowledge her existence as her daughter. I think that was a crucial factor in her becoming who she was. And there's also she almost got married at the age of 10, right? Chandramal wanted her to get married away. And if these things happened, her life would probably have been very different. But at the same time, she did make good on the privilege that she had. And she was a pathbreaker for so many women, so many generations ahead of her. So yeah, I totally agree with what you said about the inspirational side.
I think just to add to that, sorry, before Lakshmi, you go ahead. It was also resilience on her own end, because I think for Muthulakshmi Reddy in the first chapter, she mentioned that, or the author mentioned that she even wrote a letter to the king in English, asking to permit her into the college as well. So along with her privilege of being born to Narayanaswamy and having all of those opportunities, I think it was resilience on her own end to progress in her education. So I thought that was very interesting as well.
Yeah, Lakshmi, would you like to just quickly talk us through? I don't think we need to go through the details, but just to kind of have a sense of how this, how you've structured it, and then we can share the link with the group later.
Sure. So I've started with, I've mixed a little bit about the developments that occurred in each of these places. So in Mysore and in Pudukkottai, so I have the ruling dynasties, and I also have the births and like significant milestones of both of these people. And I've put them together so we have a sense of, a comparative sense of how this runs. So right now I've covered like the first two chapters of both books. So it starts at about from their birth to their education, roughly. So that's what.
Great. Thanks, Lakshmi. Thanks for sharing that. So I think we'll share the link of this timeline with all of you. So yeah, I think we're a little over an hour right now. So unless anyone has some concluding thoughts, I think it's a good place for us to pause because it's not the end of the discussion, right? We can always carry on next week. But anything anyone wants to add before we end today? Yes.
Yeah, I also thought that in earlier ages, the Devadasis were the only women who were allowed to get educated or they can learn everything. And as contradictory to that, the condition changed when Muthulakshmi Reddy has to sit in curtains. I had that thought that how much condition, means the status was changed because of the westernization. And I felt very sad when they concluded that Devadasi community was like prostitution and their art was sinful. That was the saddest part, which I thought in the introduction part. Thank you.
Anyone else? Any closing thoughts that you'd like to share? Okay. If not, just a few quick things before we finish so that we're set up for next week. So we'd love for any of you to present summaries of the chapters next week. If, of course, you can volunteer to do it. If you think you'd like to take up a chapter and present a summary for it, we'd very much welcome that. So please feel free to let us know maybe through the WhatsApp group or email if you'd like to take it up for next week so we can sort of take turns in summarizing the chapter. And what we'll try to do every week after the discussion is just kind of, bring together the ideas that were talked about along with some of these external resources with which Santosh and Lakshmi have been putting together. Maybe it could be references to papers, videos, links that are not within the chapters that we're reading, which we'll also make available to you all in one place. Okay, so and any ideas on how we can, what we can include in these discussions or change in format that you suggest are very, very welcome. So please feel free to let us know on this group, through the WhatsApp or through email. We're all ears all the time. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining in today. Lovely to meet all of you and really looking forward to the next 5 weeks. Thank you. See you all.
Right.